Most people think manipulation looks obvious. They imagine it's loud, aggressive, direct. A raised voice, a demand, a threat. But the most dangerous form of control doesn't look like control at all. It looks like compliance. It feels like responsibility. It hides beneath the mask of maturity, duty, and social norms. And that's exactly why it works. Because real control doesn't come from chains. It comes from scripts you didn't even know you were following. You go along. You cooperate. You say yes when you want to say no. You stay quiet when everything inside you is screaming. But you think it's your choice. You think it's your nature. You think you're being good, reasonable, respectful. What you don't realize is you've been trained to obey without resistance. This is covert compliance, the silent system of control that governs your behavior without needing force. No one threatens you. No one restrains you. No one raises their voice, because they don't have to. You do it to yourself. You second-guess your instincts. You censor your truth. You shrink your power, automatically, subconsciously, silently. And that's the brilliance of covert manipulation. It makes you believe you're still free, while you're already owned. But here's the part that no one tells you. This control doesn't start in adulthood. It doesn't come from one manipulator. It doesn't need a villain. It starts early. It's built layer by layer through conditioning, repetition, and emotional programming. It hides in your childhood, in your culture, in your family, in the words you were taught to fear, and the approval you were trained to chase. By the time you're grown, the script is so deep, you call it your personality, but it's not. It's a compliance code, installed long before you had a choice. In this video, we will dismantle that code. You'll learn how covert compliance is installed into your mind. You'll see the tools used to make you obedient without force. You'll understand why you follow rules that were never yours. And most importantly, how to break out without making noise, because the loudest rebellion isn't rage. It's clarity. It's cold awareness. It's the moment you stop reacting automatically and start choosing consciously. And once you do that, you become untouchable. Let's begin. Part 1. What is covert compliance? Covert compliance is the most insidious form of control because it never introduces itself as control. It disguises itself as politeness, as responsibility, as being a good person. But beneath the surface, it's a silent contract you never signed, yet still follow. It's when you obey, not because you want to, but because something invisible inside you whispers. If you don't, something bad will happen. There's no shouting, no explicit punishment, no direct confrontation, but somehow you still comply. You show up when you're drained. You agree when you're unsure. You stay silent when you want to speak. And the worst part? You convince yourself you made that choice. That's what makes covert compliance so powerful. It turns obedience into self-regulation. You become your own jailer. You enforce the rules they never had to say out loud. It's not control through commands. It's control through conditioning. The rules are not written, but they are felt. Don't rock the boat. Don't disappoint them. Don't speak too boldly. Don't make others uncomfortable. And slowly, over time, those whispers become internal law. You begin to shrink before you're even told to. You anticipate consequences that were never verbalized. You adjust your behavior in advance for approval you're not even sure you'll get. That's covert compliance, invisible control through internalized fear. And here's the paradox. It's not always malicious. Sometimes the system wasn't created to harm you, but it still conditioned you to serve it. At the cost of your freedom, your voice, your identity. Families do it. Schools do it. Cultures do it. Relationships do it. Society does it. And unless you know how to see the invisible mechanisms behind your behavior, you'll keep calling obedience loyalty and submission kindness. But the truth is brutal. Most people aren't being respectful. They're just afraid of rejection. Most people aren't being responsible. They're just afraid of guilt. Most people aren't being mature. They're just following a script they didn't write. Next, we'll go deeper. How this silent programming gets installed in your mind, starting from childhood, long before you had the tools to resist. Part 2. How conditioning begins. The silent installation of obedience. No one is born compliant. Compliance is installed, quietly, systematically, and early. Long before you could think critically, long before you had a voice strong enough to push back, you were already being programmed, not by force, but by repetition. Every "be a good boy." Every "nice girls don't talk like that." Every "don't question adults." Every "stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about." These phrases weren't commands, they were scripts. Small sentences, subtle corrections, casual tones. But each one carried a deeper message. Obedience is safety, rebellion is danger. And your nervous system absorbed that message like a law of nature. You weren't taught boundaries. You were taught compliance equals love. You weren't taught individuality. You were taught approval equals survival. So you adjusted. You complied. You made yourself smaller, quieter, easier to manage. Because the fear wasn't punishment. The fear was emotional rejection. No child wants to be wrong. No child wants to be unloved. No child wants to be left out of the tribe. So you adapted, automatically, unconsciously, deeply. You became the version of yourself that kept things smooth, that kept others happy, that kept the system intact. And you thought that was maturity, that was discipline, that was being well-behaved. But in reality, it was the beginning of covert psychological imprisonment. Because once compliance becomes your safety mechanism, you carry it into everything. You comply in relationships to avoid abandonment. You comply at work to avoid conflict. You comply socially to avoid judgment. Not because anyone is threatening you, but because the threat lives inside your nervous system now. And here's the trap. The people who conditioned you may not even realize they did it. It wasn't always malicious. It was inherited, passed down, normalized. But what's normalized still controls you until you break it. And now, let's decode the exact tools these systems use to make sure your obedience runs on autopilot through guilt, approval, social shame, and subconscious submission. Part 3. The hidden tools of subconscious control. Covert compliance doesn't require chains. It uses tools that feel harmless until they quietly shape your entire identity. These are not physical weapons. They are psychological triggers engineered to keep you in line without confrontation. And the most dangerous part? You don't even notice them being used because they've been wrapped in the language of love, loyalty, and morality. Let's dissect the most common tools of subconscious control. First, guilt, the emotional leash. Guilt is one of the most powerful manipulation tools ever created. It doesn't scream. It whispers, "How could you do this to us? After everything we've done for you, you're being selfish." Guilt flips the power dynamic without force. You start punishing yourself, while the manipulator watches you collapse. And the worst part, you believe you deserve it. 2. Approval, the emotional drug. Obedience is often rewarded with praise. Good job. You're so mature. We're proud of you. Sounds innocent, right? But this praise becomes a drug, and now you're addicted to external validation as proof of worth. You shape your behavior around what will earn that hit again. And the system wins, because now you control yourself in exchange for approval. 3. Fear of disappointment, the silent threat. There's no punishment more effective than the threat of letting someone down. You don't want to make them angry. You're terrified of making them sad. So you comply, you bend, you suppress your truth, just to avoid the look of disappointment on someone's face. That's not love. That's emotional blackmail disguised as morality. 4. Social pressure, the invisible cage. One of the most subtle forms of control is the phrase, "Everyone else is doing it." You don't want to be excluded. You don't want to be different. You don't want to be the one who breaks the unspoken rule. So you obey. Not because you agree, but because non-compliance threatens your belonging, and that threat is often more powerful than any logic. 5. Language framing, the hidden commands. Control often hides in the phrasing itself. It's the right thing to do. Real men don't act like that. A good daughter would understand. You should know better. These are not just sentences. They are psychological scripts loaded with shame, identity pressure, and silent obligation. And every time you comply with them, you reinforce the control mechanism without even realizing it. That's how covert systems maintain obedience, not through domination, but through subtle engineering of guilt, fear, shame, and the hunger for approval. Next, let's go deeper into the effect. Why you don't even notice you're being controlled because the system made you believe you're choosing it freely. Part 4. Why you don't notice you're being controlled. The most effective control system is the one you don't see, because when control is loud, people resist. But when control is subtle, people defend it. That's the brilliance of covert compliance. You don't feel imprisoned. You feel well-adjusted. You don't feel manipulated. You feel reasonable. You don't feel oppressed. You feel mature. Because the system doesn't just control your behavior, it hijacks your identity. 1. Internalization makes control look like personality. After years of conditioning, you stop seeing the system as external. It becomes internal dialogue. You tell yourself, "I'm just not the type to cause trouble. I'm the responsible one. I always try to keep the peace." But these aren't traits. They're installed scripts, written by others, reinforced by fear, and executed by you. And you call them personality. That's how deep the programming goes. 2. Compliance is framed as virtue. You've been taught that obedience equals goodness. So when you comply, you feel morally superior. When you sacrifice your needs, you feel noble. When you silence your voice, you feel emotionally intelligent. But ask yourself, who benefits from that obedience? If your virtue is based on self-erasure, it's not virtue, it's compliance dressed as integrity. 3. Resistance is framed as immaturity. When you try to set boundaries, you're called difficult. When you question expectations, you're labeled rebellious. When you walk away from toxic roles, you're accused of being selfish or cold. So you start suppressing your instincts, not because they're wrong, but because you've been taught to associate resistance with shame. And the system wins again, because you begin to self-police even your discomfort. 4. You mistake fear for logic. You think you're being practical. You think you're making a wise choice. But deep down, you're reacting from fear. Fear of disapproval, fear of exclusion, fear of losing belonging. The problem is, fear disguised as logic feels reasonable, so you follow the rules, while thinking it's your idea, but it never was. 5. You've been taught to question yourself before you question the system. Whenever you feel resistance inside, you don't ask, "Is the system broken?" You ask, "What's wrong with me?" That's the final trap. You've been trained to doubt your own truth before you ever doubt the structure that silenced it. And until that changes, you'll keep obeying a system that doesn't even need to ask anymore. But once you see it, truly see it, you can start breaking the invisible code. Part 5. How to break the invisible scripts. You can't fight what you can't see, and you can't reclaim your mind until you know what's been silently writing your behavior. But once you identify the script, you can delete it. You don't need to scream. You don't need to confront the system loudly. You just need to start choosing consciously where you once reacted automatically. Here's how you start breaking the invisible code. 1. Ask the right question. Who benefits from my compliance? Every time you feel guilty for saying no, every time you feel selfish for choosing yourself, pause and ask, who taught me that this was wrong? And who gains when I keep believing it? This one question alone begins to crack the script wide open. Because control always hides behind the illusion of duty. But once you see who benefits from your silence, you start reclaiming your voice. 2. Trace the origin of the reflex. That instinct to shrink, that reflex to please, that guilt when you rest. These aren't natural traits. They're installed reactions. Trace them back. Who taught you that love must be earned? Who rewarded you for being quiet? Who made you fear being misunderstood? When you trace the source, you realize you've been living someone else's emotional blueprint, and that blueprint ends now. 3. Disrupt the script with conscious friction. Every time you feel the reflex, pause. Don't comply automatically. Don't apologize for existing. Don't explain your boundaries. Instead, introduce conscious disruption. Say no without justifying. Take space without guilt. Speak your truth without softening it for comfort. At first, it will feel wrong, not because it is, but because the old script is screaming in protest. That's proof you're breaking it. 4. Rewire your identity beyond approval systems. You are not here to be liked. You are not here to perform goodness. You're here to live from clarity, not compliance. Create a new identity, one that isn't tethered to praise or fear. You are powerful without being agreeable. You are valid without being needed. You are whole without being approved. That shift from external validation to internal authority is liberation. 5. Let others feel the discomfort of your freedom. When you stop complying, others will react. They will test you. They will guilt you. They will say, "You've changed." And they're right, because you're no longer dancing to invisible music. You're moving on your own terms, cold, conscious, unapologetic. And some people will never forgive you for breaking the script, because your freedom exposes their slavery. Let them sit with it. Real freedom isn't loud, it's conscious. You don't need to rebel violently to be free. You don't need to destroy the system to escape it. You just need to see it. clearly, coldly, consciously, because the most dangerous control was never physical. It was always psychological. It wasn't the chains on your hands. It was the scripts in your head. And once you start seeing them for what they are, expectations, patterns, emotional triggers, social conditioning, you begin to unhook. You stop reacting. You start observing. You stop performing. You start choosing. And that is real freedom, not noise, not drama. Just quiet, unwavering sovereignty. You don't need to explain your detachment. You don't need to justify your boundaries. You don't need to seek approval for not needing approval anymore. You simply live from a different place now. A place where guilt has no grip, where shame has no weight, where silence is not submission, it's command. And that's what the system fears most. A person who sees the game, but refuses to play. You weren't born to comply. You were trained to. But now you know. Now you've seen the strings. Now you hold the scissors. Let others stay in the loop. Let others keep chasing the gold stars. You've outgrown that currency. From this point forward, your energy is no longer for sale. Your voice is no longer filtered. Your presence is no longer a tool for someone else's comfort. You choose where your power flows. You choose what you respond to. You choose who gets access. And most of all, you choose yourself first. That's not arrogance. That's not rebellion. That's clarity, because the system can only control you. As long as you believe you owe it something, you don't. End the compliance. Reclaim the mind. Run your own script. Transmission complete.